My name's Sally. I'm one of the ministers here at TBC. And before I begin, I do want to apologise to anyone who's been driving down the Ridgeway this week and obsessively looking at their speedometer. I know I have this week after my sermon last week. So it's my joy to begin our mini-series of the three wise women. And we start off with Elizabeth, and we're going to watch a video. I wonder if you believe everything you see on the news or read in the newspaper. I can still remember this April Fool's pseudo-documentary about spaghetti growing from trees, and I do remember thinking it was slightly strange. My lovely mother was a terrible cook, and so she'd never cooked pasta. It was way too exotic in those days. It was meat and too veg for her. But so I couldn't actually work out whether it was true or not at the time. The term false news is a phrase that's been bandied around in recent years, and nobody now knows what or who to believe. The writer of Luke's Gospel, however, wants us to know the truth, and he is addressing his letter to Theophilus, saying that he's written an orderly account of the things that have happened, so that Theo can trust everything that he has been taught. Luke has gone to the very sources and spoken to eyewitnesses, so that those who read what he has written will know that this story really happened in time and in place. He doesn't want Theo to think it might be fake news. And so Luke's very precise in his history and geography. And so if anybody wanted to query or question this story, they'd quickly be able to disprove it as they looked up some of the facts that Luke lays out. So right after his introduction, he immediately mentions King Herod of Judea. King Herod was a really nasty piece of work by any standards. He was tyrannically cruel, suspicious, and vindictive. One commentary said that as long as he lived, no woman was safe and no man's life was secure. In fact, the word on the street was it was safer to be Herod's pig than to be his son. He was detested by his subjects, and we're familiar with his name because he killed all the boys under the age of 2 who were living in Bethlehem at that time. Secular history says that his vengeance and cruelty and bloodshed were of such proportion that the Jewish historians didn't even bother mentioning this incident of the murder of the innocents in their writings. It was simply lost in the scheme of atrocities that marked Herod's reign. So when you read the words, in the days of Herod of Judea, what we need to understand is that it was equated to the darkest and most evil days that men can remember. And in the darkness and in the evil, God was about to turn on the lights. He was preparing for the arrival of one who was not himself the light, but whose existence was to point people to the light. The true light of every man was coming into the world, namely in the person of the Messiah. And so the first thing to notice is this: God is at work in the darkness. It was 400 years since the last prophetic voice. And in the middle of all this, there was a temptation for people to say, where's God now? What's God going to do? Has God forgotten all about us, about his promises? What about the things the prophets said would happen? And maybe we feel the same way today. There are wars and rumors of wars. It's a dark world: global warming, climate change, violence, rebellion, narcissism, kids cancelling their parents, poverty, the cost of living. I could go on. It feels dark, and many of us are praying, Lord Jesus, come. When I first became a Christian, I was about 20 years old, and there was an awful lot of teaching about Jesus' return. A book had just been written called The Great Late Planet Earth by a guy called Hal Lindsey that scared everybody to death, I think. But I was 20, I hadn't got married, I hadn't had children, so I was praying, please don't come yet, Jesus. He can now come because I've crossed that off my bucket list. But it was in this darkness that Zechariah and Elizabeth lived. And despite the challenges and difficulties of life, they were careful, it says, to obey God's law in spirit as well as in letter. But they had no child because Elizabeth was barren. And because of that, they suffered disgrace. And for many years, Elizabeth had to carry the unspoken sorrow of barrenness. In Jewish culture, children were seen as a blessing from God, a sign of his favor. But Elizabeth had none. Whispers behind her back stung like daggers. Perhaps God closed her womb as a punishment. What good was she, a priest's wife, who couldn't give him an heir? Her nickname in the community was the barren one. Can you imagine the pain that must have caused her, each time reminding her that she was unable to conceive? She pretended not to hear, but she did. And every baby crying in the marketplace was a reminder. Every mother's laugh was a contrast to her silent home. Yet through it all, she remained faithful. She prayed, she worshipped, she waited, she kept her hope in God. She didn't stop serving God with all her heart and living in obedience despite her struggles. Her faith in God was unaffected by the fact that she was childless. I've met Christians who've suffered in all sorts of different ways, but they have walked away from God because they didn't receive what they needed or wanted. And some of you have had to suffer the pain of childlessness, or maybe your children or grandchildren have failed to conceive a child that they so desperately wanted. The pain is very real and very deep. And all we can do is give it to God and trust him and ask him to heal our hearts. Zechariah, though, had stopped hoping. He still prayed, but more out of duty than expectation. They were old now. In fact, they were at least 60 years old, because in those days, life expectancy was shorter than it is now. So 60 was regarded as a threshold for old age. They didn't know, like we do now, that 60 is the new 40. Well, so I tell myself. So the context is deep darkness, and personally, there's a shadow over their home. But their names may have been an encouragement to them, because Zechariah means the Lord remembers, or the Lord watches over you. And Elizabeth means my oath, my God is an oath, or my God is faithful, or if you like, my God keeps his promises. Secondly, this God is at work in the line of duty, because Zechariah was faithfully serving as a priest. He was simply doing his duty. I don't know about you, but I think duty is an underrated word. Finding volunteers who faithfully turn up is quite difficult to come by, you'll find. And I thank God for each person here who week after week turns up, preparing communion and coffee, tending to our garden, preparing helping at all our various ministries, Little Stars, Open House, midweek communion, food bank, brigades, debt advice, reception, worship bands, sound desk, so many, putting up decorations, so many different things. So week after week, he would perform his priestly functions. But one day, something very significant happens. He was chosen by lot to enter the temple of the Lord and burn incense. And it's highly significant because actually there was only one temple and around 20,000 priests serving that temple. And the burning of incense, it took place in the morning and the evening. And that was an assignment that was made as a result of drawing lots. So your chances of your name being chosen were very slim. In fact, it was probably a once-in-a-lifetime event. And imagine if Zechariah had not been faithful, not done his duty, and not turned up that week. John the Baptist would never have been born. And so my encouragement to anyone here today is just to continue to be faithful. Turn up when you say you will. Even if it's not very glamorous, to the Lord, it's really important. God sees it all. He honors your faithfulness and duty and simply turning up. And so it's also if you're feeling unappreciated as you serve in various ways, at work maybe, or at TBC, I do also want to say a huge thank you to each person. We so appreciate each one of you. And we are so sorry for the times that we don't express that enough. God honors duty. This assignment was a privilege and unique, and as Zechariah went into the temple, multitudes gathered outside and are praying at the time of burning the incense. But just as he gets his big moment, he gets interrupted, and an angel of the Lord appears. And in this encounter, Zechariah is to discover that God is not only at work in the darkness, God is not only at work in the line of duty, but God is also at work in the gift of a son. The angel said, "Don't be afraid, Zechariah. Your prayer has been heard because your wife Elizabeth will have a son, and you're going to call him John, which means Yahweh shows grace. And the result of this will be for your joy and gladness, not only for you, but for many. And you need to know," says the angel, "that he will be great before the Lord." True greatness is greatness before the Lord, who searches the hearts of everyone. If we determine greatness in terms of human gifting, we've gone wrong, because the great we all want to be is great before the Lord, because one day we're going to stand before him, and he knows the ups and downs and the ins and outs. He knows your motives. He knows everything about us. And I find that quite challenging, and I suspect that the people we consider great on earth won't necessarily be great before the Lord. It's so easy, isn't it, in our culture to admire the wrong people, people who are beautiful, people who are famous for no other reason than they have appeared on some reality TV program. I want to be great before the Lord, don't you? And it's very easy in life just to keep your head down, get through another day, cope with that day's challenges. It's easy to lose perspective. But we need to remind ourselves on a regular basis that our citizenship is in heaven, and that one day we'll stand before God and give an account of our lives. And our lives may not be very glamorous or have the same impact as John the Baptist, but God will reward us if we take each day and live it simply for him. The Christian life is not a sprint, it's a marathon. Eugene Peterson writes in his book, A Long Obedience in the Same Direction, "We need roots in the past to give obedience, ballast and breadth. And we need a vision of the future to give obedience, direction, and goal." Zechariah is stunned. How can this be? My wife is well along in years. I thought we were going to Sainsbury's to buy incontinence pads, not Pampers. Gabriel tells Zechariah that because he didn't believe his words, he'll be silent until the child is born. And the reaction of Zechariah is not exactly what you'd call positive. He does not react with faith. And it's quite encouraging, I think, that his uncertainty cannot abort the unfolding plan of God. Sometimes I think we think it's all down to us. We think we've heard God, but then the situation might change or doesn't change. And we question ourselves and we question God. And we become, as the book of James described, like the waves of the sea, blown and tossed by the wind. I'm just like Peter. I think about all the times that God has been faithful to me and rescued me from some really challenging, painful circumstances. And then I think, that's it, relax, Sally, and trust. Give it all over to God. And then the next trial comes along, and then again I struggle, and I'm back to worrying again. God does respond to our faith. In fact, he says it's impossible to please God without faith. But you're human, and we're all human. And our faith isn't always a cast iron faith. But God's purposes still prevail. It doesn't all rely on us. So that's an encouragement to me, that God is at work, even when God's servants, and that includes us, react badly. So Zechariah stays on at the temple for the remaining days of his temple duty. And when he finally arrives home, he tries to explain through writing and gestures what has just happened. And it doesn't say in the gospel account, but I believe Elizabeth believed what God communicated to her, because I think if she didn't, she may well have been struck dumb as well. Around 20 weeks, Elizabeth feels something she's never felt, a stirring in her womb, a life growing within her, and tears fill her eyes. It was true. The angel's words were true. She places her hand on her belly and whispers, "The Lord has taken away my disgrace." And this is a reminder that God is in the business of restoring what is lost. He turns our pain into joy and disgrace into honor. And what seemed like a permanent condition for Elizabeth was actually just a temporary trial. Many people carry the weight of shame, whether from past mistakes, failures, or circumstances beyond their control. But God sees beyond our situation. Just as he lifted Elizabeth's reproach, he can do the same for you, no matter what society has labelled you or dealt you. It's never too late. God's opinion is the only one that matters. He sees your faithfulness, your perseverance, and your trust in him. And when his time comes, he'll lift you before those who once doubted you. For 5 months, Elizabeth remains in seclusion, a time of preparation for the upcoming birth. No more whispers of shame, no more empty prayers. God has remembered her. God is at work in the waiting. So one day her niece Mary arrives at her home in the hill country in Judea. And as soon as Mary greeted Elizabeth, she felt the baby leap inside her. And Elizabeth was filled with the Holy Spirit. Elizabeth was the first person to acknowledge that this baby was the long-promised Messiah. So Elizabeth returns home, and when it's time for Elizabeth to have her baby, she gives birth to their son, and everyone's thrilled to bits. All the neighbours and relatives gather round to celebrate. And when they ask what the child's name is, they expected her to say Zechariah after his father, but Elizabeth shakes her head. His name is John. Everyone protested. No one in their family had that name. I wonder if you have children, when you announce the name, how many people decided to comment on that name? When we told my mother that we were naming our third son Maximilian, but Max for short, she was appalled. She said it was a showbiz name. And I also remember many conversations around the family dinner table talking to our 4 sons about names for babies. And I said, do make sure that you name your baby something sensible that you can spell and remember. They completely disobeyed me. And I think actually I was probably influenced by my mother, who was called Cicely. And she said all her life she hated her name because nobody could pronounce it. They'd call her Cecilia or Cecil or something, and neither could they spell it. So the boys went and chose names that we couldn't pronounce either or spell. Inaya, try spelling that. I had to learn it, and Oriella. So I did, though, keep my mouth shut and not tell them that. So it stays in this room. Everyone thinks so, that they have a say in a name, don't they, that you give your baby. But Zechariah and Elizabeth remained firm and insisted on it, and Zechariah's voice returned. Elizabeth had been so patient and had waited and waited for her child, but God had not forgotten her. He'd heard her prayers, and it was a setup for something greater. Had Elizabeth conceived earlier, John the Baptist would never have been born at the exact moment needed to prepare the way for Jesus. When we feel like we've been waiting too long for a breakthrough, it's so easy to think that God's just forgotten us. But waiting is not wasted time, it's preparation time. Just like a farmer doesn't expect a harvest the day after planting seeds, we must trust that God's timing is aligned with his greater purpose. So if you're in a season of waiting for, it could be a medical procedure or healing or moving house or a new job or direction, remember Elizabeth. And then God is at work in our fellowship. When Elizabeth conceived, she didn't just keep the news to herself. She shared a special moment with Mary, as we just saw. When Mary arrived at her house, Elizabeth was immediately filled with the Holy Spirit, and Elizabeth immediately spoke blessings over Mary, affirming her faith. She didn't doubt her younger cousin's story. Instead, she encouraged her. And it just highlights the importance of surrounding ourselves with people who encourage our faith. When God begins to move in your life, not everyone's going to celebrate with you. Some people will doubt or criticize. Some will try to plant seeds of discouragement. But Elizabeth's relationship with Mary reminds us that divine connections matter when you're in a season of faith. If you're stepping into a new calling or believing for a breakthrough or waiting on God, surround yourself with people who will speak life over you. Find those people who will remind you of God's promises rather than feed your doubts and fear. During COVID, when Gareth, my husband's business, was failing, I was really careful who I spent time with and who I listened to. Because for a while my anxiety levels were just so sky high and I thought we were going to lose everything. And I found I needed to hear stories about how people had overcome their challenges and difficulties and where God had broken through for them. So when you're going through a difficult time, find people who will encourage you and not be prophets of doom and gloom. And ask your friends to tell you about a time when God came through for them. And finally, God is at work in our surrender. In Luke 1, verse 76, Zechariah prophesies that John, the Baptist, his own son, will be a prophet. And I wonder how Elizabeth felt about that. After all, many of the prophets had a long history of being ignored and killed. Zechariah was stoned to death in the temple. Jeremiah stoned to death in Egypt. Isaiah killed by King Manasseh. Ezekiel slain in Chaldea. Habakkuk stoned to death in Jerusalem. And of course, John goes on to lose his life. Many prophets faced great danger in their role to deliver God's messages. And I guess she must have been really worried about her newborn son's safety and how he would be received by people. But verse 66 says the Lord's power was upon him. If Elizabeth knew that God has his hand on John and that all that God would say would happen had come to pass, it would follow that Elizabeth would have to trust God and surrender her precious son to him. Having children is certainly first and foremost a blessing, but as I said in the dedication, is certainly a challenging task. When our children are young, we get so worried, don't we, for them, their development, how quickly they learn to walk, how, are they potty trained or not? You worry about them hurting themselves and scraping their knees, their safety, their progress at school. But when you become adults, you worry about very different things that have greater consequences. For example, who they marry, their career choice or lack of it, the friends they spend time with. And I've been worried about my sons variously over the years, but for some time I was very worried about a particular son, and it would keep me awake at night. And I kept praying, and nothing much seemed to change. I felt that knot of anxiety each time he'd get in with the wrong crowd or date the wrong girl. And one day I was praying, and I was reminded of the story of Moses. And if you remember, Pharaoh put out an edict that all boys under the age of 2 should be thrown into the river Nile. And Moses' mother hid her son, Moses, until he got too large to hide. And so she made a little basket made of reeds and made it watertight with tar. And then she put the baby in the basket and placed it in the tall grass at the edge of the river, and then watched the basket float away. And that river was full of crocodiles and hippopotami. And Moses' mother must have been praying for his safety. She didn't know where the basket would land up and what would happen to her son. There must have been so many questions and potential terrible outcomes for her to think about or imagine. And when I found that my anxiety was overwhelming, I imagined putting my child in that Moses basket, and I prayed, Lord, thank you that you love my child even more than I do. I surrender my child to you. I'm going to trust you whatever happens, and I choose to believe that you will bless my child and direct his path. And I watched the basket float away in my imagination, and it was something I had to do again and again and again. But eventually God came through, and my son found his way back. And maybe you have a child or a grandchild right now who you're just really worried about. And maybe today is the day to do the same as I did. So how does Elizabeth's story help us today? Elizabeth's story reminds us that God is at work in the darkness. God is at work in the line of duty. God is at work even when God's servants react poorly. God is at work in the waiting. God is at work in our fellowship with one another. And God is at work as we surrender everything to him.